well, as Clive's already explained, we're going to be looking in Paul's letter to the Romans today, chapter 12, and we're going to be looking at 2 verses. And if any of you think that means a short sermon, hard luck, they're very hard-packed. So it's Romans chapter 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Now, does anyone remember what the first word was? Therefore. In other words, there's been a whole lot of stuff that has gone before. In the first 11 chapters of Romans, we have been hearing a great deal about God's intervention and what Jesus has done to put right the world that has gone so drastically wrong as a result of rebelling against its maker. And we have seen how in spite of the fact that we were so helpless because we were so impacted by all this, Jesus has actually done everything necessary to bring us back into relationship with God, to renew that which was spoiled and broken. And it's all the way through about God's mercy, God's grace. And belonging to God's family, coming into his kingdom, has nothing whatsoever to do with anything we achieve by ourselves. We can't do it. And so Paul has been extolling the grace and mercy of God up to this point. And we've found the solid ground we're standing on. I can be totally secure because I can never do anything to spoil what Jesus has done. I can stand solid and secure, knowing that I belong to God and that his purpose is going to be worked out in my life. And that's the point. So having been talking about God's grace, God's free gift, he then says, therefore, what I want you to do, he says, in view of all God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. So up till now, we've been hearing about what has been given for us. Now we come to the switch around point, where we start to talk about how we respond to that. God has intervened to deal with the problem, but now we're going on to why he has done this, what it is he wants from us. And it's very interesting. It's first and foremost, it's to live a life of worship. That is what life is about. Now, I wonder what you think of when you think of the word worship. I'm not talking about being able to sing for 2 hours solidly and play a guitar. Now, obviously, singing is a way of praising and worshipping God, but that is not the definition of worship. Nor is it about getting a whole new set of rules and sort of implementing them and trying to keep them in spite of everything. That is part of worship, offering yourself, serving him. Yes, serving is worship. And of course, to the people to whom Paul is speaking, in the culture of the 1st century AD we're talking about here, for people going to worship, whether they were Jewish people going to the temple in Jerusalem, or whether they were Gentiles going to all sorts of pagan temples with weird and wonderful idols at the center of them, what the main aspect of worship there was sacrifices. And of course, sacrifices were killed. They were animals who were killed. Their blood was shed. But now Paul is saying, after that one perfect sacrifice that Jesus has made, all that is now redundant, unnecessary, finished with. But there's still a sacrifice to be made, but this time it's a living sacrifice. When you laid the animal on the altar and killed it, it didn't have any choice about staying there. But here he's saying, offer your bodies. And that's not just your physical being, it's the whole of you. When you give your body to somebody, you're giving your very self to them. So here we are saying, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice. This sacrifice is not dead. This sacrifice has to make a choice about staying on that altar. Because actually this is about a sacrifice that's going to be lived out. You're not going to be dead. So, and Paul says this, now in the New International Version, which I was reading, it says this is your spiritual act of worship. The word that's translated there as spiritual, in other translations you'll find it's your reasonable worship or your logical worship. The last one is quite a good one because the Greek word used is logiken, which is actually all about your mind, your thinking, your rationality. In other words, it's deliberate, it's intentional. And what he's saying is that in view of all that God has done for us, the only rational, sensible, obviously sane answer is to offer ourselves back to him in order to fulfill the purpose for which he saved us. And it's not just about coming to church on Sunday. Obviously, that's one of the things we do. We gather together. We gather together to praise God, to thank him, to learn from him. But it's not just about what you do on a Sunday. See, on a Sunday, the amount of time you spend here on a Sunday morning, especially if you're not somebody that comes every single week, if you put that in terms of the number of hours in your year, it's a very small percentage. But actually, the life of worship that God has called us to is something that occupies every minute of every hour of every day of every week of every month of every year of our lives. That's when we're supposed to be worshipping. And as I say, it doesn't mean that you spend all your time on your knees praying or at your guitar singing, although those will be part of the overall process. But this is the thing, the living sacrifice has to stay on the altar, and every day has to make that choice again. I will stay here. I will offer myself for the purpose of God. And why? What is the point of it all? What is the aim of this sacrifice? Well, it tells us a bit further back in chapter 8 of Romans, and verse 29, it says this, those whom God foreknew, in other words, had already chosen in advance, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. In other words, the reason God called and chose you and saved you is so that you might become like Jesus. That is the point of your salvation. Not just to be able to tick the box and say, phew, that's it. I don't have to worry about dying now. I won't go to hell. That's not what it's about. It's about becoming the person you were meant to be. And the first step in that is in response to this mercy to lay our lives before him for his purpose. Now, and yes, that is a rational, reasonable, obvious, only sane thing to do. So then he says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. I'm going to read that in Tom Wright's translation because I think it brings it out a little more clearly. Don't let yourselves be squeezed into the shape dictated by the present age. Instead, be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you can work out what God's will is, what is good, acceptable, and perfect or complete. Now, the one word he left out of his translation is here. It says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. In other words, this is not something that you've just started to do. This is what you've already been doing. And the word that is used for conform, it is actually talking about something that's squeezed into a mold. You know, if you want to make little chocolates, you melt the chocolate, and then you've got your little molds in different shapes of animals or whatever. You pour it in there, it will set hard, and then you can dish them out for children's parties or whatever. Because what you're doing, you're taking something that is soft, putting it in a mold and changing its shape so that it comes out looking exactly like the mold. And Paul says this is what's been happening to all of us up until the point when the Holy Spirit enters us and the new life of the kingdom comes into us. So he says, stop doing that. Stop letting yourself be squeezed into the mold of the world. The word is aeon, which actually is talking about the age, the present age, what surrounds you. Stop being squeezed into its mold. You see, you don't even notice it happening because it's all around you. And we're talking here about things like the decisions you make, which are based on the values you have, the things you believe are true, the things you believe are good, the things you believe are evil. On that basis, we make our decisions. And if you're just living in this world, you will find that without even realizing it, you've begun to imbibe the standards, the latest fads, the latest fashions, the latest ideas as to what's acceptable or not acceptable. And it's all this present age. This present age is passing. That sort of applies on a smaller level. I mean, I was born in the 1950s. If you were walking down the street in the 1950s, people looked very different. My dad used to wear a hat at all times and lift it when a lady walked by. Ladies were always wearing hats as well. And the fashions were just different. All sorts of things. That's just a trivial example. But I'm very aware that the world I live in now has a very different feel from the world I lived in as a child. Some things that were absolutely normal then are not normal or even permissible now. Other things that at that time seemed absolutely terrible are suddenly okay. It's the way things change. Because this age, what's right and what's wrong, that can change according to what the current fashion is. What's true or what's false? Well, it depends what you want to believe is true or false. You see what I mean? But that will shape the person you are, the opinions you have, the choices you make. And of course, it's a world that is fallen. It's a world that is fallen because it rejected the one who had the right to say what is good and what is evil. Because it didn't want God telling us what's good and evil. We'll make our own rules, thank you. You've heard me say that a lot, haven't you? Anyway, what is to be done if you're not going to be squeezed into the mold? There's another word used there. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, the little illustration Clive was doing earlier with, making butterflies on these pieces of paper, that helps us to understand what's being said here. This is not squeezing the outward shape into something a bit different. This is actually changing the basic inside essence. And the change comes from the inside out. The Greek word is the one from which we get the word metamorphosis. And if you're at all into biology, you'll know that that's what happens to maggots, bugs, larvae, caterpillars, when they go into the pupa or the cocoon or whatever else you want to call it. When they come out, they look entirely different. And it isn't because while in the pupa, they sort of stuck on some wings or they kind of rearranged their bodies a bit to look different. They metamorphosized. It's a complete change. It's the only time I ever got anywhere near dissecting anything when I was at school. I didn't fancy, frogs, rats, none of that sort of stuff. But I do remember when it was early in my biology education, the teacher brought in a whole load of housefly pupae, these little round, hard brown things, and we were all given one. And we were supposed to sort of open it, and sort of see what's going on inside. We were given a pin. I stuck my pin in, and this yucky, yellowy goo squirted out. And I thought, that was revolting. And I didn't go any further. The point is, though, when the bug, when the little larva went in there, the little maggot went in there, it wasn't liquid goo. It was a little wriggly thing that could crawl about and that had been eating for a long time. But once it was in the pupa, everything was broken down and changed. And then what comes out is a whole new creature. It is the same bug, but suddenly this beautiful butterfly with all its glorious wings and all its new possibilities is there. That is what metamorphosis means, and that is the word that is translated transformation. It's much more radical than just sort of squashing the same old stuff into a slightly different shape. And this present world shapes your outer being, but God wants to change your inner being, and from that will come something totally different. So, the other place in the scriptures where that word metamorphosis, or it's the original Greek word, is mentioned, is on an occasion when Jesus went up a mountain with 3 of his disciples. And while he was up there, they said his appearance changed. He was transfigured. And suddenly his face was shining, and they began to get a little glimpse of the real Jesus, the one he always had been, who was there, made flesh, walking among them, looking like the carpenter from Nazareth that he was. And yet inside there was something so much more, and they got a little glimpse of the being inside that. And if you read the book of Daniel, it tells you that after the resurrection, that this is the very end bit of Daniel, that after the resurrection, God's people will shine like the stars forever and ever, because what is on the inside is coming out. See, when you become a Christian, when you surrender yourself to Jesus and receive what he's done for you, you become a new person. There's a new life begins in you. And actually, that caterpillar, that larva, it is that same being, only it's being changed into something much more glorious than what it started off. And so that life within you, God is working to transform you. And this is where we also just have to remember that it is a command. Do not be conformed any longer to this world. That is a command. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That is also a command. But you'll notice, if you're at all into grammar, the verb is in the passive voice. In other words, it's not something you do, it is something that is done to you. You'll get squeezed into this world's mold without even knowing it. And when it comes to the being transformed, having our minds renewed so that we begin to think differently, that is something that God does by his Holy Spirit. It's not something, that we just sort of get a new set of rules and grit our teeth and try our level best to be different. No, actually, I am different. And as I begin to allow that life in me, as I feed on that life of Jesus, he says, that's why we have communion as our sort of central worship act. It's because actually it's reminding us the source of our life is Jesus. That's the food that we take into ourselves. When we're feeding on his word, when we're with him, we begin to change. Because your food makes your body grow. And I don't look like I did 73 years ago. Not all the changes have been for the better, but perhaps some have. I can do a few things that I couldn't do when I was first born. But this is the thing, we change as we're living and growing, living sacrifices, allowing God to transform us from inside. And what is it he's transforming? The word is mind. Now, we're not talking here about how clever you are or your ability to do maths or, your ability to paint pictures or whatever. We're talking here about how you look at the world. The whole sort of frame through which you view things. It's about your values, your moral judgments, the things that you think are good or the things that you love or the things that you hate. And again, that little exercise we did earlier, we're talking about actually those things do change. And some of them need to change. You need to start valuing things that before you really didn't think were important at all. And you need to stop being enslaved by things which are damaging you. But it's all about how you see things. It's what you're looking at. What are we focusing on? You see, we are made to be in relationship with God. And one of the wonderful things that Paul also writes in his letter to the Corinthians, hang on, I've got it written down. 2 Corinthians 3:18, talking about people who have been born again, who are moving on with Jesus. We who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. In other words, once you're in relationship with Jesus, as you're gazing at him, that glory is being reflected more and more. You're getting more like him because you get more like the people you keep company with. That's why it's so important to be in fellowship with people who know Jesus, because that will help to stimulate and challenge you to see, actually, this is where I need to go. When I look at somebody who's further on than me, I think, yeah, that's an example to follow. When I'm struggling, I've got somebody else who's in the same boat saying, yeah, come on, we'll do it together. And the more we understand what he's like as we focus on him, the more we're drawn to that. We begin to see, actually, this is what I really want. And so we come to this last bit of the passage. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. People often say to me, well, how do you know God's will? Well, for a start off, once you start focusing on the Lord and allowing him to shape your thoughts, you'll find that actually you understand because you know it. It's like when I was a child, there were certain things I would not do because I knew my father would not like it. I had not had to ring him up every time and say, Dad, is it all right if I do this thing which is bad? I knew my father. I knew the things he didn't approve of. I knew the things he did approve of, the things that he would be proud of in me. You see, in relationship, you get to know what that person's like. And at the beginning of the book of Romans, we find in chapter 1 the description of the world and the mess it's in. And because people chose to worship the creation rather than the creator, because they chose their own way, they decided to go with what their appetites were telling with them rather than what is right. It says 3 times the phrase used, God gave them over. God gave them over. God gave them over. And it was to, the word is translated differently in various, a reprobate mind, a debased mind. In other words, God handed them over to what they'd chosen so they could find out the hard way what a stupid choice it was, because they wouldn't learn the wise way. But the word that's used for the depraved mind, the debased mind, whatever your translation says, the Greek word is actually one that's connected with testing metal. You know, if you want to know if your gold's pure or your silver's pure, what do? You take it to somebody who's got the assaying equipment, they heat it up, they melt it, and all the dross comes to the surface. And so they can see how pure that metal is. And if they were doing that and it turned out it wasn't silver or gold at all, it was some rubbish base metal, well, that didn't pass the test. That was not proved. It was discarded for the rubbish heap. And the Greek word for this, rejected, unproved rubbish is adokimos. When we come to Romans 12 and this bit here about then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. The verb there is from that same word, dokimazo. In other words, now, it's not that you will be the one whose mind has been rejected, discarded because there was no gold. In fact, you'll be somebody who is now in a position to actually do the testing, to know the difference, to begin to learn the knowledge of good and evil according to what God says rather than out of your own imagination. And you will begin to discover that the will of God, which to us in our natural state often seems like a big challenge, something that oh dear, that's going to be frightening. Oh dear, that's going to be hard. Oh dear, that's going to mean I've got to do stuff I don't enjoy and I can't do the stuff. There's that sort of whole negative mindset that God's keeping you out of the good stuff, which was, Satan's initial lie. Instead, you will find that as you begin to test and approve the will of God, you find, hey, it's good. In other words, it's not going to harm me. It's actually good. And it's acceptable. In other words, actually, I can like it. I can enjoy it. It's good. I can find pleasure and joy in his will. And what's more, it's perfect. It's complete. There's nothing lacking. There is no better thing to be found. And as you become more familiar with the will of God, as he shapes your mind to approve of the will of God, you will gradually discover that you also find you have a natural understanding of when something isn't good. The secret of, if you're a bank clerk or something, the secret of being able to recognize a fake note or a fake coin is not to be an expert on every fake coin that's been produced and all the different banknotes, the fakes to look for. The answer is to know the real thing so well that the minute something doesn't quite match, it's fake. And when we allow the Lord to renew our minds, this is the bit about staying on the altar, allowing him to do what he can do, rather than rushing off trying to do our own stuff, we find that actually we become so familiar with what is good that what is evil becomes something you don't want anymore. And it becomes perfect. His will becomes our will because we see this is pure gold. And this also is a gift, but it's something he does in us day by day, hour by hour, as we submit to him, allow him to continue his work in us that he's begun. Because as it says in his word, he who began a good work in you will continue to perform it until the day of Jesus Christ.